Hello, welcome to another Tales of Horror by H.P. Lovecraft. Today we are reading the final conclusion to Reanimator. We are going to be doing Acts 5 and 6. So this is going to be the final acts of this tale. The ending, the climax. So far, to recap what the events that have already occurred up to this point, we have a mad scientist by the name of Herbert West who has met a partner during his studies in the college that they or university that they were attending. And this tale is being told through the lens of this assistant slash a partner that is witnessing Herbert West's obsession with reanimating dead tissue and bringing it back to life. And you're reading the accounts of this man who is witnessing almost a Frankenstein like obsession in his colleague. And he's describing the events of finding dead bodies that are suitable for their experiments and the difficulty behind it, and how some of them have succeeded in very limited context, and the horrors that have driven or the horrors that have basically come to light from those experiments, all accumulating to our last tale of them finding a fresh body that now, in its moment of life, lets out screams of helplessness. With its last sentence, "Help, keep off, you cursed little towhead fiend. Keep that damn needle away from me." So, with Act 5, we continue this tale. So grab your blankies, grab your snackies, because it's time for a tale of horror. Act 5. The Horror from the Shadows. Many men have related hideous things not mentioned in print, which happened on the battlefields of the Great War. Some of these things have made me faint, others have convulsed me with devastating nausea, while still others have made me tremble and look behind me in the dark. Yet despite the worst of them, I believe I can myself relate the most hideous thing of all, the shocking, the unnatural, the unbelievable horror from the shadows. In 1915, I was a physician in the rank of first lieutenant in a Canadian regiment of Flanders, one of many Americans I precede the government itself into the gigantic struggle. I had not entered the army on my own initiative, but rather as a natural result of the enlistment of the man whose indispensable assistant I was, the celebrated Boston surgical specialist Dr. Herbert West. Dr. West had been avid for a chance to serve as surgeon in the Great War, and when the chance had come, he carried me with him almost against my will. There were reasons why I would have been glad to let the war separate us, reasons why I found the practice of medicine and the companionship of West more and more irritating. But when he had gone to Ottawa, and through a colleague's influence secured a medical commission as major, I could not resist the imperious persuasion of one determined that I should accompany him in my usual capacity. When I say that Dr. West was avid to serve in battle, I do not mean to imply that he was either natural warlike or anxious for the safety of civilization. always an ice-cold intellectual machine, slight, blonde, blue-eyed, and spectacled. I think he secretly sneered at my occasional martial enthusiasms and censures of supine neutrality. There was, however, something he wanted in embattled Flanders, and in order to secure it, he had to assume a military exterior. What he wanted was not a thing which many persons want, but something connected with a peculiar branch of medical science, which he had chosen quite clandestinely to follow, and in which he had achieved amazing and occasionally hideous results. It was in fact nothing more or less than an abundant supply of freshly killed men in every stage of dismemberment. Herbert West needed fresh bodies because his life work was the reanimation of the dead. This work was not known to the fashionable clientele who had so swiftly built up his fame after his arrival in Boston, but was only too well known to me, who had been his closest friend and sole assistant since the old days of the Miskatonic University Medical School in Arkham. It was in those college days that he had begun his terrible experiments, first on small animals and then on human bodies shockingly obtained. There was a solution which he injected into the veins of the dead things, and if they were fresh enough, they responded in strange ways. He had much trouble in discovering the proper formula, for each type of organism was found to need a stimulus especially adapted to it. Terror stalked him when he reflected on his partial failures, nameless things resulting from imperfect solutions or from bodies insufficiently fresh. A certain number of these failures had remained alive. One was in an asylum, while others had vanished, and as he thought of conceivable yet virtually impossible inevitabilities, he often shivered beneath his usual stolidity. Stolidity. West had soon learned that absolute freshness was the prime requisite of useful specimens, and had accordingly resorted to frightful and an unnatural unnatural expedites in body snatching. Expedients? Expedients in body snatching. In college and during our early practice together in the factory town of Bolton, my attitude towards him had been largely one of fascinated admiration. But as his boldness and methods grew, I began to develop a gnawing fear. I did not like the way he looked at healthy living bodies. And then there came a nightmarish session at the cellar laboratory when I learned that a certain specimen had been a living body when he secured it. That was the first time he had ever been able to revive the quality of rational thought in a corpse, and his success, obtained at such a loathsome cost, had completely hardened him. Of his methods in the intervening 5 years, I dare not speak. I was held to him by sheer force of fear, and witnessed sights that no human tongue could repeat. Gradually, I came to find Herbert West himself more horrible than anything he did. That was when it dawned on me that his once normal scientific zeal for prolonging life had suddenly degenerated into a mere morbid and ghoulish curiosity and secret sense of charnel picturesqueness. His interest became a hellish and perverse addiction to the repellently and fiendish abnormal. He gloated calmly over artificial monstrosities which would make most healthy men drop dead from fright and disgust. He became, behind his pallid intellectuality, a fastidious Baudelaire, a physical experiment, a languid Langibalis of the tombs, a languid Lagabalis. Dangers he met unflinchingly, crimes he committed unmoved. I think the climax came when he had proved his point that rational life can be restored, and had sought new worlds to conquer by experimenting on the reanimation of detached parts of bodies. He had wild and original ideas on the independent vital properties of organic cells and nerve tissue separated from natural physiological systems, and achieved some hideous preliminary results in the form of never dying, artificially nourished tissues obtained from the nearly hatched eggs of an indescribable tropical reptile. Two biological points he was exceedingly anxious to settle. First, whether any amount of consciousness and rational action be possible without the brain, proceeding from the spinal cord and various nerve centers, and second, whether any kind of ethereal, intangible relation distinct from the material cells may exist to link the surgical separated parts of what was previously been a single living organism. All this research work required a prodigious supply of freshly slaughtered human flesh. And that was why Herbert West had entered the Great War. The phantasmal, unmentionable thing occurred one midnight late in March 1915 in a field hospital behind the lines of St. Eloi. I wonder even now if it could have been other than a demonic dream of delirium. West had a private laboratory in an east room of the barn-like temporary edifice, assigned him on his plea that he was devising new and radical methods for the treatment of hitherto hopeless cases of maiming. There he worked like a butcher in the midst of his gory wares. I could never get used to the levity with which he handled and classified certain things. At times, he actually did perform marvels of surgery for the soldiers, but his chief delights were on a less public and philanthropic kind, requiring many explanations of sounds which seemed peculiar even amidst that babble of the damned. Among these sounds were frequent revolver shots, surely that uncommon on a battlefield, but distinctly uncommon in a hospital. Dr. West's reanimated specimens were not meant for long existence or large audience. Besides human tissue, West employed much of the reptile embryo tissue which he had cultivated with such singular results. It was better than human material for maintaining life in organless fragments, and that was now my friend's chief activity. In a dark corner of the laboratory, over a queer incubating burner, he kept a large covered vat full of this reptilian cell matter, which multiplied and grew puffily and hideously. Puffily and hideously. On the night of which I speak, we had a splendid new specimen, a man at once physically powerful and of such high mentality that a sensitive nerve system was assured. It was rather ironic, for he was the officer who had helped West to his commission, and who was now to have been our associate. Moreover, he had in the past secretly studied the theory of reanimation to some extent under West. Major Sir Eric Moreland Clapman Lee, DSO, was the greatest surgeon in our division and had been hastily assigned to the St. Eloi sector when news of the heavy fighting reached headquarters. He had come in an airplane piloted by the intrepid Lieutenant Ronald Hill, only to be shot down when directly over his destination. The fall had been spectacular and awful. Hill was unrecognizable afterward, but the wreck yielded up the great surgeon in a nearly decapitated but otherwise intact condition. West had greedily seized the lifeless thing which had once been his friend and fellow scholar, and I shuddered when he finished severing the head, placed it on his hellish vat of pulpy reptile tissue and to preserve it for the future experiments, and proceeded to treat the decapitated body on the operating table. He injected new blood, joined certain veins, arteries, and nerves at the headless neck, and closed the ghastly aperture with engrafted skin from the unidentified specimen which had borne an officer's uniform. I knew what he wanted, to see if this highly organized body could exhibit, without its head, any of the signs of mental life which had distinguished Sir Eric Moreland Clapham Lee. Once a student of reanimation, this silent trunk was now gruesomely called upon to exemplify it. I can still see Herbert West under the sinister electric light as he injected his reanimating solution into the arm of the headless body. The scene I cannot describe. I should faint if I tried it, for there is madness in a room full of classified charnel things. And blood, with blood and lesser human debris almost ankle deep on the slimy floor, and with hideous reptilian abnormalities sprouting, bubbling, and baking over a winking bluish green specter of dim flame in a far corner of black shadow. The specimen, as West repeatedly observed, had a splendid nervous system. Much was expected of it, and as a few twitching motions began to appear, I could see the feverish interest on West's face. He was ready, I think, to see proof of his increasingly strong opinion that consciousness, reason, and personality can exist independently of the brain. That man has no central connective spirit, but is merely a machine of nervous matter, each section more and less complete in itself. In one triumphant demonstration, West was about to relegate the mystery of life to the category of myth. The body now twitched more vigorously, and beneath our avid eyes commenced to heave in a frightful way. The arms stirred disquietingly, the legs drew up, and various muscles contracted in a repulsive kind of writhing. Then the headless thing threw out its arms in a gesture which was unmistakably one of desperation, an intelligent desperation apparently sufficient to prove every theory of Herbert West. Certainly the nerves were recalling the man's last act in life, the struggle to get free of the falling airplane. What followed, I shall never positively know. It may have been wholly an hallucination from the shock caused at that instant by the sudden and complete destruction of the building in a cataclysm of German shell fire. Who can gainsay it? Since West and I were the only proved survivors, West linked to it to think, like to think, that before his recent disappearance. But there were times when he could not, for it was queer that we both had the same hallucination. The hideous occurrence itself was very simple, notable only for what it implied. The body on the table had risen with a blind and terrible groping, and he had heard a sound. I should not call that sound a voice, for it was too awful, and yet its timbre was not the most awful thing about it. Neither was its message. It had merely screamed, "Jump, Ronald! For God's sakes, jump!" The awful thing was its source, for it had come from the large covered vat in that ghoulish corner of crawling black shadow. Act 6. The Tomb Legions. When Dr. Herbert West disappeared a year ago, the Boston police questioned me closely. They suspected that I was holding something back, and perhaps suspected graver things. But I could not tell them the truth because they would not have believed it. They knew indeed that West had been connected with activities beyond the credence of ordinary men, for his hideous experiment in the reanimation of dead bodies had long been too extensive to admit of perfect secrecy. But the final soul-shattering catastrophe held elements of demonic fantasy which make even me doubt the reality of what I saw. I was West's closest friend, and only confidential assistant. We had met years before in medical school, and from the first I had shared his terrible researches. He had slowly tried to perfect a solution which, injected into the vein of the newly deceased, would restore life, a labor demanding an abundance of fresh corpses, and therefore involving the most unnatural actions. Still more shocking were the products of some of the experiments. Grisly masses of flesh that had been dead, but that West waked to a blind, brainless, nauseous animation. These were the usual results, for in order to reawaken the mind, it was necessary to have specimens so absolutely fresh that no decay could possibly affect the delicate brain cells. This need for very fresh corpses had been West's moral undoing. They were hard to get, and one awful day he had secured his specimen while it was still alive and vigorous. A struggle, a needle, and a powerful alkaloid had transformed it to a very fresh corpse. And the experiment had succeeded for a brief and memorable moment. But West had emerged with a soul calloused and seared, and a hardened eye which sometimes glanced with a kind of hideous and calculating appraisal at men of especially sensitive brain and especially vigorous physique. Towards the last, I became accurately afraid of West, for he began to look at me that way. People did not seem to notice his glances, but they noticed my fear, and after his disappearance, used that as a basis for some absurd suspicion. West, in reality, was more afraid than I, for his abnormal pursuits entailed a life of furtiveness and dread of every shadow. Partly it was the police he feared, but sometimes his nervousness was deeper and more nebulous, touching on certain indescribable things into which he had injected a morbid life, and from which he had not seen that life depart. He usually finished his experiments with a revolver, but a few times he had not been quick enough. There was that first specimen, on whose rifled grave marks the clawing were later seen. There was also that Arkham professor's body, which had done cannibal things before it had been captured and thrust unidentified into a madhouse cell at Sefton, where it beat the walls for 16 years. Most of the other possibly surviving results were things less easy to speak of, for in later years, West's scientific zeal had degenerated into an unhealthy, fanatic mania, and he had spent his chief skill in vita- vitalizing not entire human bodies, but isolated parts of bodies or parts joined to organic matter other than human. It had become fiendishly disgusting by the time he disappeared. Many of the experiments could not even be hinted at in print. The Great War, though, which both of us served as surgeons, had intensified this sight of West. In saying that West's fear of his specimens was nebulous, I have in mind particularly in its complex nature. Part of it came merely from knowing of the existence of such nameless monsters, while another part arose from apprehension of the bodily harm they might, under certain circumstances, do him. Their disappearance added horror to the situation. Of them all, West knew the whereabouts of only one, the pitiful asylum thing. Then there was a more subtle fear, a very fantastic sensation resulting from a curious experiment in the Canadian Army in 1915. West, in the midst of a severe battle, had reanimated Major Sir Eric Morland Clapham Lee, DSO, a fellow physician who knew about his experiments and could have duplicated them. The head had been removed so that the possibilities of quasi intelligent life in the trunk might be investigated. Just as the building was wiped out by a German shell, there had been a success. The trunk had moved intelligently, and unbelievable to relate. We were both sickeningly sure the articulate sounds had come from the detached head as it lay in a shadowy corner of the laboratory. The shell had been merciful in a way, but West could never feel as certain as he wished that we, too, were the only survivors. He used to make shuddering conjectures about the possible actions of a headless physician with the power of reanimating the dead. West's last quarters were in a venerable house of much elegance, overlooking one of the oldest burying grounds in Boston. He had chosen the place for purely symbolic and fantastically aesthetic reasons, since most of the internment were the colonial period and therefore of little use to a scientist seeking very fresh bodies. The laboratory was in a sub-cellar secretly constructed by imported workmen and contained a huge incinerator for the quiet and complete disposal of such bodies or fragments of synthetic mockeries of bodies as might remain from the morbid experiments and unhallowed amusements of the owner. During the excavation of this cellar, the workmen had struck some exceedingly ancient masonry, undoubtedly connected with the old burying ground, yet far too deep to correspond with any known sepulchre, sepulchre therein. After a number of calculations, West decided that it represented some secret chamber beneath the tomb of Everils, where the last interment had been made in 1768. It was with him when he studied the nitrous dripping walls laid bare by the spades of mattock of the men, and we prepared for the gruesome thrill which would attend the uncovering of century grave secrets. But for the first time, West's new timidity conquered his natural curiosity, and he betrayed his degenerating fiber by ordering the masonry left intact and plastered over. Thus it remained till that final hellish night, part of the wall of this secret laboratory. I speak of West's decadence, but must add that it was a purely mental and intangible thing. Outwardly, he was the same to the last, calm, cold, slight and yellowish hair, with spectacled blue-eyed, and a general aspect of youth which years and fears seemed never to change. He seemed calm, even when he thought of that clawed grave and looked over his shoulder, even when he thought of carnivorous things that gnawed and pawed at Sefton bars. The end of Herbert West began one evening in our joint study when he was dividing his curious glance between the newspaper and me. A strange headline item had struck at him from the crumpled pages, and a nameless Titan claw had seemed to reach down through 16 years. Something fearsome and incredible had happened to Sefton Asylum 50 miles away, stunning the neighborhood and baffling the police. In the small hours of the morning, a body of silent men had entered the grounds, and their leader had aroused the attendants. He was a menacing military figure who talked without moving his lips, and whose voice seemed to almost ventriloquially connected with an immense black case he carried. His expressionless face was handsome to point the radiant beauty, but had shocked the superintendent when the whole light fell on it, for it was a wax face with eyes of painted glass. Some nameless accident had befallen this man. A larger man guided his steps, a repellent hulk whose bluish face seemed half eaten away by some unknown malady. The speaker had asked for the custody of the cannibal monster, committed from Arkham 16 years before, and upon being refused, gave a signal which precipitated a shocking riot. The fiends had beaten, trampled, and bitten every attendant who did not flee, killing 4 and finally succeeding in the liberation of the monster. Those victims who could recall the event without hysteria swore that the creatures had acted less like men than like unthinkable automata guided by the wax-faced leader. By the time help could be summoned, every trace of the men and of their mad charge had vanished. From the hour of reading this item until midnight, West sat almost paralyzed. At midnight, the doorbell rang, startling him fearfully. All the servants were asleep in the attic, so I answered the bell. As I had told the police, there was no wagon in the street, but only a group of strange-looking figures bearing a large square box, which they deposited in the hallway after one of them had grunted in a highly unnatural voice. "Express prepaid." They filed out of the house with a jerky tread, and as I watched them go, I had an odd idea that they were turning towards the ancient cemetery on which the back of the house abutted. When I slammed the door after them, West came downstairs and looked at the box. It was about 2 feet square and bore West's correct name and present address. It also bore the inscription from Eric Moreland Clapham Lee, St. Louis, Flanders. 6 years before, in Flanders, a shelled hospital had fallen upon the headless, reanimated trunk of Dr. Clapham Lee, and upon the detached head which perhaps had uttered articulate sounds. West was not even excited now. His condition was more ghastly. Quickly, he said, "It's the finish. But let's incinerate this." We carried the thing down to the laboratory, listening. I do not remember many particulars. You can imagine my state of mind, but it is a vicious lie to say it was Herbert West's body which I put into the incinerator. We both inserted the whole unopened wooden box, closed the door, and started the electricity. Nor did any sound come from the box after all. It was West who first noticed the falling plaster on that part of the wall where the ancient tomb masonry had been covered up. I was going to run, but he stopped me. Then I saw a small black aperture, felt a ghoulish wind of ice, and smelled the charnel bowels of a putrescent earth. There was no sound, but just then the electric lights went out, and I saw the outline against some phosphorescence of the nether world, a horde of silent, toiling things which only insanity or worse could create. Their outlines were human, semi-human, fractionally human, and not human at all. The horde was grotesquely heterogeneous. They were removing the stones quietly, one by one, from the centuried wall. And then, as the breach became large enough, they came out into the laboratory in single file, led by a stalking thing with a beautiful head made of wax. A sort of mad-eyed monstrosity behind the leader seized on the Herbert West. West did not resist or utter a sound. Then they all sprang at him and tore him to pieces before my eyes, burying the fragments away into that subterranean vault of fabulous abominations. West's head was carried off by the wax-headed leader, who wore a Canadian officer's uniform. As it disappeared, I saw that the blue eyes behind the spectacles were hideously blaring with their first touch of frantic, visible emotion. Servants found me unconscious in the morning. West was gone. The incinerator contained only unidentifiable ashes. Detectives have questioned me, but what can I say? The Sefton tragedy, they will not connect with West, nor that, nor the men with the box, whose existence they deny. I told them of the vault, and they pointed to the unbroken plaster wall and laughed. So I told them no more. They imply that I am a madman or a murderer. Probably I am mad. But I might not be mad if those accursed tomb legions had not been so silent. And that concludes the terrific reading of Herbert West's Reanimator. I hope you guys have enjoyed that classic. That concludes Reanimator. Our first tale separated into parts. That was a good one. I like that. The ending is so it's so vivid, the way he describes these beasts descending down from basically like the moonlit background is the way that I kind of picture it. Kind of like a Batman background where the moon is super huge, like a super moon, just like over the horizon. And you see these beasts making their way into the laboratory through the plaster wall. And then slowly approaching Herbert West and then dismembering him in like slow, painful, kind of torturous to like action. It's so haunting. It's so haunting. And on top of that, this sentence right here of, as it disappeared, I saw that the blue eyes behind the spectacles were hideously blazing with their first touch of frantic, visible emotion. They don't describe the emotion. You don't, it leaves it to the imagination of the reader. Like, for some people, they probably think that Herbert West's last emotion or his final visible emotion is that of fear. But because of his mad obsession, his delirium, essentially, one can even speculate that he could have had an emotion of excitement, of finally being proved correct in his theories, of reanimating corpses, not almost transcending the veil of the spirit, because he now understands that death is just a concept. There's no such thing as spirit, because his monsters have come back alive, have consciousness to have revenge, and they've taken it upon him. And now he's excited because he understands that with no idea of spirit, he lives on essentially forever in his body and in just like mind, that's just the end. There's like a sort of relief, I think, that could be drawn upon this doctor's face. It's such a scary thought, don't you think? But that's just my interpretation of this ending. I think readers are definitely going to have different. They're going to have different takes on how they perceive that ending. A lot of people are probably going to say that it's probably, the doctor's fear. I think the doctor experiences fear. He experiences the fear throughout the entire moment of like encountering the box, seeing the head, and then seeing these monstrosities approaching him. There's huge fear. But I think in those final moments, like the idea of looking at the head of Herbert West and seeing almost joy or like peace of mind is haunting. It's a haunting thought, especially for like such a like psychopathic, like the way that they describe him so psychopathically in his obsession of reanimating. It just makes sense, right? I think that's how I personally like interpret it. All right. But that concludes the reading of H.P. Lovecraft's Herbert West Reanimator. I hope you enjoyed that. For the next reading, we are going to be having The Lurking Fear. I hope you guys stop on by for that. If you're watching from YouTube, make sure you hit the like button down below. And if you like, also comment. It helps out with the algorithms quite a bit. If you'd like to watch live, I also do this on Twitch. So make sure you go to twitch.tv/stigmaxoxo and go follow the channel. It'll let you know when I'm going live. I usually do these like sort of kind of like late night-ish. I try to do them sometime around 10 p.m. PST, sometimes 11, but yeah, it usually falls around that time, kind of like nighttime hours. You're going to bed, you want just like to hear a nice little tale. And the HP Lovecraft stories are not the only ones that we read. I'm doing mostly these horror stories just for the month of October. We're going to have more Grimm's fairy tales probably sometime in November. Although I do have plans for something special for November, and I hope you guys are excited for that. But I hope you guys have enjoyed this tale of the Reanimator, and I hope you look forward to the next few tales as well. As always, good night. Don't let the Cthulhu's bite, and don't stay a stranger. Until the next one.